The date was October 24th, 1942, and the place was a rotting green hell known to the native islanders as Guadalcanal, but known to the men of the United States Marine Corps simply as the Canal. The atmosphere was not merely dark, it was a suffocating physical weight that pressed down on the lungs and the eyes of every man huddled in the foxholes along the ridge. This was the jungle of the Solomon Islands, a place where the heat did not dissipate when the sun went down, but rather settled into the mud and the decaying vegetation, creating a humid convection oven that smelled of wet earth and unwashed bodies and fear. It was pitch black, the kind of absolute darkness that exists only where civilization has never touched a void, so deep that a man could hold his hand 3 inches from his face and see nothing but the phantom shapes conjured by his own terrified mind. The rain fell in intermittent sheets, washing away the sweat, but doing nothing to cool the skin, and in the brief silences between the squalls, the jungle came alive with a cacophony of insects that sounded like grinding metal. But on this night, the insects were not the sound that caused the stomachs of the Marines to tighten into hard knots of dread. It was the other sounds drifting up from the dense canopy below the ridge, the sounds of thousands of men moving with lethal intent, creeping through the undergrowth like a rising tide of black water. The isolation felt by the Marines on Guadalcanal was total and absolute, a feeling of abandonment that gnawed at the soul harder than the hunger gnawed at their bellies. The United States Navy, having suffered catastrophic losses in the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, had been forced to withdraw its carriers, leaving the Marines stranded on the beachhead with dwindling supplies and no prospect of immediate rescue. They were fighting on a starvation diet, rationing meager portions of captured Japanese rice because the American rations had long since run out. Their uniforms were rotting off their backs, turning into rags that clung to their emaciated frames, and nearly every man was suffering from some combination of malaria, dysentery, or fungal jungle rot that ate away at the skin between their toes and fingers. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed ghosts, holding the line against an empire that had never known defeat an enemy that had swept across the Pacific with the unstoppable momentum of a tsunami. Deep in the black abyss below the defensive line, held by the 2nd Battalion 7th Marines, the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, specifically the elite Sendai Division, were gathering like a storm front. These were not conscripts pulled from the rice paddies. These were battle-hardened veterans of the campaigns in China, men who had marched thousands of miles and who viewed death in service to the Emperor not as a tragedy, but as the ultimate spiritual fulfillment. They were not trying to be silent anymore, because the time for stealth had passed and the time for psychological terror had begun. The young Marines, clutching their Springfield rifles and their Browning automatic rifles in the mud, could hear the distinctive clinking of metal on metal, the sound of bayonets being fixed to Arisaka rifles, and the rattle of mess kits, and the terrifying rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The Japanese commanders were masters of night operations, believing that their spiritual superiority allowed them to see in the dark where the materialistic Americans were blind. They knew exactly where the Americans were, and they knew that the Americans were tired and sick and stretched dangerously thin across a line that was too long for their numbers to hold. The enemy below began to execute a tactic designed to shatter the nerve of the defenders before the first shot was fired, utilizing the jungle acoustics to amplify their presence. From the darkness came voices shouting in broken, jagged English, screaming insults that were both absurd and chillingly effective in the dead of night. They screamed that the Marines would die tonight. They screamed blood for the Emperor, and they laughed with a manic energy that echoed off the trees. This was psychological warfare in its most primal form, designed to make the young Americans feel isolated and hopeless, to convince them that they were surrounded by a horde of demons rather than men, to make them doubt their weapons and their leaders and their own sanity. To a fresh recruit just out of boot camp in San Diego, these disembodied voices promising a violent death in a godforsaken jungle were enough to induce paralysis. But Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page was not paralyzed. Page was a man carved from the bedrock of the old Corps, a professional soldier, who viewed the battlefield not as a place of emotional expression, but as a grid of fields of fire and tactical problems to be solved with high-velocity lead. He had served in the Philippines and China before the war, and he understood the Asian theater better than the officers who commanded him. He crouched low in his fighting hole, checking the traverse and elevation mechanism of his weapon, for the 10th time that hour, ignoring the sweat that dripped from his nose and the stinging bite of the mosquitoes that carried the malaria parasite. He listened to the taunts drifting up from the ravine, specifically the voice shouting purely American profanities and threats about marine blood. And he did not feel fear. He felt a cold, calculating rage. He knew that the noise was a screen, a distraction to cover the sound of sappers cutting the barbed wire and heavy weapons teams moving their Nambu machine guns into flanking positions. Page moved down the line, checking on his men touching a shoulder here, and whispering a command, there his presence, a stabilizing anchor in the rising tide of panic. He told them to hold their fire, to wait for the targets to reveal themselves, to let the enemy come into the kill zone that he had meticulously mapped out in his mind during the daylight hours, explaining that muzzle flashes in the dark would only give the enemy mortar teams a point of aim. The position that Mitchell Page held was the linchpin of the entire American line, a gentle grassy slope that commanded a view of the approaching jungle. And if this position fell, the Japanese would have a clear path to Henderson Field, the airstrip that was the prize of the entire campaign. The airfield was the heart of the American presence on the island, the only link to the outside world, the only place where the Cactus Air Force could launch their Wildcats and dauntless bombers to strike at the Japanese Navy. If the airfield fell, the Navy pilots would have nowhere to land, the supply chain would be cut, and every Marine on the island would be slaughtered or taken prisoner in a repeat of the tragedy at Bataan. Page understood the stakes with a clarity that surpassed that of the general sitting in command tents miles away because he could smell the enemy. He knew that the Sendai Division was not throwing a probing attack at them. This was the main event, a full-scale banzai charge intended to sweep the Americans into the sea by sheer weight of numbers. He checked the ammunition belts for his machine guns, running his fingers over the brass cartridges, ensuring that they were seated perfectly in the cloth loops, because a jammed gun tonight meant death, not just for him, but for every man behind him. The noise from below grew louder, a rising crescendo of screaming and the clatter of equipment, and then suddenly the clicking sound began. It was the sound of Japanese soldiers tapping their grenades against their helmets to arm the fuses, a sound like 1,000 crickets made of steel and high explosives signaling that the assault was imminent. The weapon that Mitchell Page trusted with his life and the lives of his platoon was the Browning Model 1917 A1 heavy machine gun. This was not a sleek, modern weapon of the space age. It was a brutal industrial machine born in the trenches of the First World War, a beast of iron and steel and water that weighed nearly 40 pounds on its own and over 100 pounds with its tripod and water and ammunition. To the uninitiated, it was a clumsy relic, a static anchor that limited mobility. But to Mitchell Page, it was a masterpiece of engineering, a precision instrument capable of sustaining a rate of fire that would melt the barrel of a lighter gun in minutes. The heart of the weapon was the water jacket, a heavy steel cylinder surrounding the barrel that held 7 pints of water, designed to absorb the immense heat generated by the friction of bullets traveling at 2,800 feet per second. When the gun fired, the water would boil and the steam would travel through a rubber hose into a condensing can, where it would turn back into water to be reused, a closed-loop system that allowed the gun to fire continuously for hours, as long as the ammunition held out. Page knew every spring and pin and rivet of this gun he could field, strip it in the pitch black with his eyes closed, and put it back together before a man could smoke a cigarette, adjusting the headspace and timing by feel alone. Most men looked at the Model 1917 and saw a crew-served weapon, a gun that doctrine dictated required a squad of men to operate effectively. The manual stated clearly that you needed a gunner to fire the weapon, an assistant gunner to feed the ammunition belts and manage the water levels and ammunition carriers, to haul the heavy wooden crates of .30 caliber rounds. It was a static weapon designed to be set up in a fortified position and never moved, a pillbox gun, a fortress gun, designed for the stalemate of trench warfare, not the fluid chaos of the jungle. But Mitchell Page possessed a heretical view of warfare, a belief that the rules of the manual were written by men who sat at desks and not by men who had to hold a ridge against a human wave. In his mind, the machine gun was not an anchor that tied him to the ground. It was a sword that he could wield. He had spent hours practicing drills that his superiors would have considered insanity, lifting the heavy gun receiver and barrel and water jacket all in one piece, feeling the dead weight of it straining his back and his arms. He practiced moving it alone, running from foxhole to foxhole, dragging the heavy tripod, or sometimes just cradling the searing hot water jacket in his arms, like a child cradling a burning log, conditioning his body to ignore the searing heat that would radiate from the metal during sustained fire. The heresy of Mitchell Page lay in his understanding that in the chaos of a night attack the crew would die, the support would fail, and eventually a man would be left alone with his machine. He prepared his fighting positions with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on paranoia, digging multiple pits and connecting them with shallow trenches so that he could shift the gun from one point to another to deceive the enemy about his numbers. He prepared the ammunition belts himself, inspecting every single round for corrosion or dents that could cause a stoppage, because the cloth belts of the 1917 were notorious for swelling in the damp jungle air and causing the gun to jam. He kept the belts dry in ammo cans until the last possible second, and he kept a bottle of oil close at hand to lubricate the action, knowing that the mud of Guadalcanal was an abrasive paste that would grind the internal mechanisms to a halt. He set up fields of fire that interlocked, creating a wall of lead that nothing could pass through. Alive, ensuring that the grazing fire was set at knee height, so that even if a man crawled, he would be cut to pieces. He cleared lanes of fire through the tall kunai grass, using a machete to ensure that there were no obstructions that could deflect a bullet or provide cover for an approaching enemy sapper, effectively turning the jungle slope into a manicured killing ground. As the rain intensified, turning the foxholes into muddy swimming pools, Page sat behind the gun and felt the cold steel of the spade grips in his palms. He did not see the weapon as a separate entity, but as an extension of his own nervous system, a prosthetic limb that spat fire and death. The water in the jacket was cool now, but he knew that within seconds of opening fire, it would be boiling, and the gun would be bucking against his shoulder with the rhythmic thudding of a jackhammer. He visualized the internal mechanism, the bolt flying back, extracting the spent casing, the carrier stripping a new round from the belt, the firing pin striking the primer. It was a mechanical ballet of violence that required constant attention and respect. He knew that firing the gun alone was physically punishing, that the recoil would batter his body, and the heat radiating from the receiver would blister his skin, but he accepted this pain as the price of admission. He was prepared to become the tripod. He was prepared to become the cooling system. He was prepared to merge with the iron and the brass until there was no Mitchell Page left, only the gun and the trigger and the darkness. The preparation went beyond just the mechanical. It was a psychological conditioning, a hardening of the soul against the horrors that were to come. Page knew that when the attack came, it would not be a tactical maneuver, it would be a slaughter, a collision of flesh and ideology. The Japanese soldiers charging up that hill were not afraid of death. They welcomed it. They sought it as a path to glory and spiritual redemption, believing that to die for the emperor was to become a guardian god of the nation. To stop men like that, you could not just wound them or suppress them. You had to obliterate them. You had to dismantle them physically with high-caliber rounds. Page adjusted the elevation wheel on the tripod, locking the gun onto the likely avenue of approach where the jungle thinned out into the kunai grass. He placed extra boxes of ammunition within easy reach, stacking them in the mud so he wouldn't have to fumble for them in the dark. He checked his sidearm, a designated Model 1911 pistol, and placed a row of grenades on the lip of his foxhole, their pins straightened for quick pulling. He was a one-man fortress, a technological anomaly in the primitive mud, a heresy against the established doctrine of infantry warfare, waiting to unleash an industrial storm. Then the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, because it was the silence of a predator crouching to spring. The rain drummed against the hollow metal of the water jacket, a tinny rhythmic sound that seemed to count down the seconds. Page took a deep breath, inhaling the thick, wet air, and flipped the safety latch on the back plate of the Browning to the fire position. He did not tremble. He did not pray. He simply watched the wall of blackness in front of him and waited for the world to explode. The first sign was not a visual one, but a tactile one, a vibration in the ground transmitted through the mud and into his knees as thousands of feet began to pound the earth in unison. Then came the scream, a collective roar from 2,000 throats that tore the night apart. Banzai! A flare popped overhead, drifting down under a small parachute, bathing the landscape in a flickering, ghastly green light. And there they were. The slope was moving. It was a carpet of brown uniforms and glistening bayonets, a tidal wave of humanity surging up the hill toward the thin line of Marines. Page squeezed the trigger, and the Browning Model 1917. A one roared to life, answering the scream of the enemy, with the deep, thumping staccato of American heavy firepower. The muzzle flash of the Browning was a strobe light in the abyss, illuminating the charging enemy in terrifying freeze-frame snapshots. The first belt of ammunition disappeared into the chamber in less than 60 seconds, sending 250 rounds of ball ammunition tearing through the humid air. The Japanese soldiers in the front ranks disintegrated, their bodies turned into ruin by the physics of high-velocity impact. But for every man that fell, 2 more stepped over his corpse. The jungle floor, which had been solid ground moments ago, was now slick with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and steam. The water in the cooling jacket of Page's gun began to boil exactly as he knew it would, sending a jet of white steam hissing into the condensing can, but the gun did not jam. It hummed with a lethal mechanical rhythm, a vibration that rattled Page's teeth and shook his bones. To his left and right, the other positions were not holding. He could hear the screams of his fellow Marines as the human wave crashed over their parapets, the dull thud of rifle butts against skulls, and the wet sound of bayonets finding flesh. The line was breaking. The defensive perimeter was dissolving into a chaotic brawl, where the technological advantage of the machine gun was nullified by the sheer suffocating weight of numbers. The crucible of combat had stripped away all pretenses of strategy, leaving only the primal struggle for survival. Page swung the heavy gun on its traversing dial, sweeping the fire back and forth like a scythe cutting through wheat. He saw faces in the flashes contorted in rage and agony. He saw the glint of swords and the dull reflection of helmets. He felt a round strike the blast shield of his gun, ringing like a church bell, but he did not flinch. His world had shrunk to the iron sights and the tracers streaking out into the dark. Then the gun to his immediate left went silent. He screamed for a status report, but there was no answer. Only the guttural shouts of Japanese soldiers pouring into the gap. Page realized with a sickening lurch in his gut that his platoon was being overrun. The flank was gone. The support was dead. The intricate web of fire he had designed was unraveling strand by strand, leaving him exposed on all sides. He was no longer a sergeant commanding a unit. He was a singular point of resistance in a collapsing universe. He kept firing until the belt ran dry, then reloaded with the speed of a magician, his hands moving by muscle memory, alone, ignoring the searing heat of the receiver. He knew that if he stopped for even 10 seconds, the wave would crest the ridge and wash him away. Mitchell Page was now an island in a sea of enemies. His assistant gunner was dead, his body slumped over the ammo crates. His ammo carriers were dead or wounded. The firing line was gone, leaving only Mitchell Page and his overheating machine. In this moment of total isolation, the training and the heresy fused into action. He did not retreat. He realized that if he stayed static, he would be swarmed, so he began to move. He ran from one silent machine gun position to another, clearing jams and firing bursts into the dark, trying to create the auditory illusion that the entire platoon was still alive. He was playing a deadly game of shell games with the Sendai Division, appearing in one spot, unleashing a torrent of fire, and then vanishing into the shadows before the enemy mortar teams could zero in on his muzzle flash. The physical exertion was immense, hauling the heavy gun through the sucking mud, slamming it down onto its tripod, feeding a new belt, and firing again. The barrel was glowing a dull cherry red inside the water jacket, and the steam was hissing violently, scalding his hands, but he could not feel the pain anymore. He was operating on pure instinct, a biological machine fighting a mechanical war. When the guns ran dry, he did the unthinkable. The Japanese had breached the perimeter and were now inside the wire, swarming over the foxholes. Conventional wisdom dictated that a machine gunner without ammo or a tripod was a dead man, but Page defied convention. He unlatched the heavy, searing hot Browning from its tripod and cradled the 40-pound mass of steel in his arms. The water jacket was boiling hot, burning his skin through his uniform, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins acted as a morphine anesthetic. He stepped out of the foxhole and into the open darkness, screaming at the top of his lungs, charging directly into the face of the bonsai. This was not the act of a rational man. This was the act of a man who had accepted death and decided to dictate the terms of his own end. He was a demon, wreathed in steam and muzzle flash, firing from the hip, cutting down the shadows that lunged at him. The Japanese soldiers who had been told that the Americans were soft and cowardly froze in confusion at the sight of this lone figure advancing against an army. They hesitated, and in war, hesitation is death. Page poured fire into them, not aiming, but directing the stream of lead like a fire hose, walking the bullets into the mass of men. He felt bullets tugging at his clothes. He felt the wind of shrapnel on his cheek, but he did not stop. He picked up a Springfield rifle from a fallen Marine and fired it until it was empty, then grabbed a Thompson submachine gun and emptied that too. He was operating in a state of berserker fury, a trance state where fatigue and pain did not exist. He was the embodiment of the Marine Corps spirit, distilled into one man, holding one ridge. He saw a Japanese officer charging him, sword raised high, screaming a war cry, and Page met him with a burst of .30 caliber fire that lifted the man off his feet and threw him backward into the mud. He engaged in hand-to-hand combat, using the heavy machine gun as a bludgeon when the ammunition finally ran out, smashing the steel receiver into the helmets of the enemy. The sheer violence of his counterattack was infectious. Seeing their sergeant charging into the teeth of the enemy, the few surviving Marines rallied. They climbed out of their holes, fixing bayonets, and following the madman with the machine gun, turning the tide of the battle through sheer brute force. For hours he fought like a man possessed, running the gauntlet of grenades and mortar fire, refusing to yield a single inch of ground, to the Empire rallying the few surviving Marines to his side and leading them in a counterattack that drove the Japanese back down the bloody slope. When the sun finally rose over Guadalcanal, it revealed a landscape that defied comprehension. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy mist clinging to the ground, but the mist could not hide the carnage. The jungle, which had been green and dense, was now shredded and torn, as if a giant beast had thrashed through the undergrowth. In front of Mitchell Page's position, the bodies of the enemy were stacked like cordwood, a grim monument to the effectiveness of the Browning machine gun and the will of one man. The grass was painted red, and the smell of death was heavy and sweet in the morning air, mixed with the metallic tang of spent brass and the chemical reek of explosives. Reinforcements arriving on the ridge found Page sitting in the mud, surrounded by mountains of spent casings, his uniform torn and stained, his eyes staring 1,000 yards into nothingness. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in second-degree burns from the boiling water jacket of his gun, but he was alive, and the line had held. The Henderson Field airstrip remained in American hands, ensuring the survival of the beachhead. The Japanese assault had been broken against the rock of his resistance, an entire regiment, stopped by the ferocity of a single platoon sergeant. They counted 33 dead Japanese soldiers directly in front of his gun, but hundreds more lay scattered down the slope, victims of his mobile one-man army. Mitchell Page would go on to receive the Medal of Honor, the highest award his nation could bestow, standing on a parade deck in a clean uniform, while a general pinned the blue ribbon around his neck. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry, but words on paper could never capture the reality of that night in the jungle. The man who stood there was not the same man who had dug into the ridge. He had left a part of his soul in the mud of the Solomon Islands. He lived the rest of his life as a quiet, humble man, never boasting of his deeds, carrying the weight of that night in silence. He was a hero to the public, but to himself, he was simply a Marine who did his job when the world fell apart. He passed away years later, an old man in a peaceful bed, but until his dying day, he remained the ghost of Guadalcanal, the man who stared into the abyss of a banzai charge and forced the abyss to blink.